Chock's Hangar. I'm sure you recognise that, even though I was murdering it. That's Led Zeppelin's The Immigrant Song, about Norse mythology, Vikings and all that kind of stuff. And that is because today we are reviewing the Lionheart Bellanca Super Viking. You see, it's always a mad reason for me doing this musical stuff. That's just been released, I think yesterday, as of when I'm recording this. So you know, just literally come out. And it's an update to one that they brought out a few years ago. So let's check it out, see whether it's any better, and see whether it's worth having.
To truly understand the story of the Bellanca Viking, we have to go back a ways in time. Back to when that story began. Back, in fact, to the year 1886, for it was in that year that Giuseppe Mario Bellanca was born. And born with him was a desire to fly with the angels. In a dance as old as time, I'm sorry, I can't keep up that Morgan Freeman voice, I just can't do it. And that Shawshank music's really put me off as well. Can we knock that off? I'll just do it in my normal voice.
That's more like it. So, Giuseppe Mario Bellanca, he was born in 1886 in Italy, and he got an engineering degree. And after he had his engineering degree, we're talking about 1908, 1909, that kind of period, he began designing aircraft in Italy, mostly parasol wing designs, and they were very successful. He made quite a name for himself. However, like a lot of people with ambition in that period, they saw the United States as really being the land of opportunity. So in 1911, Giuseppe Bellanca emigrated to the United States. Now, it is kind of tempting, when we're talking about people emigrating to the United States, to imagine that he's a bit like the poem on the plinth of the Statue of Liberty, the New Colossus, by Emma Lazarus, which says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, temptress tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Now, that's referring to people turning up in the United States, penniless but with dreams. Now, that hardly applies to Giuseppe Mario Bellanca. Yes, he emigrated to the United States in 1911, but he'd already made a name for himself in aviation. He was already pretty well known, and he wasn't skint either. So in 1912, the year after he arrived in the United States, in New York, he started a flying school. The Bellanca Flying School, rather unsurprisingly, and lots of prospective aircraft designers did do that sort of thing, and there was a good reason for it. Obviously, if you could teach well-to-do people how to learn to fly airplanes, they would then want an airplane of their own, and if you were an aircraft manufacturer, then you had effectively created your own customer. That's why a lot of aircraft designers in that period had their own flying schools, and that was true of Bellanca. And he trained some, like most people that had flying schools, he trained some famous people. Probably most famous, trained by Bellanca, was another Italian, a guy called Fiorello LaGuardia. Now, if you know anything about New York, you probably recognise that name. LaGuardia was famous for being the mayor of New York City 3 times. And LaGuardia Airport at New York is named after Fiorello LaGuardia. So there you go. Now this tells you that that Giuseppe Bellanca was kind of moving in the right circles. I mean, this is a guy that was on the cover of Time magazine, so you know it wasn't some non-entity. But unfortunately, like a lot of designers who had their own flying schools that they started in that period, those endeavours tended to be curtailed by the onset of the First World War and the United States becoming embroiled in that conflict. So Bellanca's flying school lasted from 1912 until 1916, which was of course the middle of the First World War, when the US were gearing up to become involved in it. So obviously their focus was on manufacturing, training aircraft that the armed forces had already accepted, and that's where Bellanca's involvement lay in that period. But after the end of the First World War, Bellanca started up his own aircraft company. Now, a guy who was fairly instrumental in that, and not just that, but a lot of other aircraft companies, is a guy called Victor Roos, who you may or may not have heard of. But Victor Roos was hugely influential in aircraft design in the United States. I mean, this is one of the founding members of the Travel Air Company. If you've seen my video on the Boeing Stearman, that talks about all that kind of period and the development of biplanes. Victor Roos was a founding member of the Travel Air Company. He was also a founding member of the Cessna Company, along with Clyde Cessna, and he was a founding member of the Roos Bellanca Aircraft Company, which was founded in the early 1920s. Now, initially that was in New York, but it eventually ended up moving out to Nebraska to produce stuff. And Bellanca was a very, very talented and very, very innovative aircraft designer, and there's perhaps no better indication of this than if you go to the Smithsonian Institute in the United States, because if you go there, you will find an aircraft that dates from 1922, which is the Bellanca CF. It's a really, really beautiful aeroplane, made of sort of mahogany and all laminated and beautiful, and it is actually the first ever cabin monoplane, which gives you an idea of how innovative Bellanca was, that he was the first one to produce one of those. It's also got a lot of other innovations on it. The struts, which support the high wing on it, are also lifting surfaces, so effectively it's a sesquiplane rather than a monoplane. And it was a massively influential design, that. If you look at other aircraft from that period, they all tend to follow that look of the Bellanca CF. The first Cessna that was built, the Cessna AA, looks a lot like the Bellanca CF. And there's another aircraft, even more famous than that, which looks a lot like it. Now, I'm sure you've heard of a guy called Charles Lindbergh. Now, Charles Lindbergh, obviously, first guy to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1927, so 5 years after that Bellanca CF was produced. And the reason that Lindbergh wanted to do that, obviously he was into aviation, wanted to make a name for himself, but there also happened to be a $25,000 prize for the first person to do it. I think it's called the Ortig prize. And Charles Lindbergh wanted to get his hands on that, but he didn't really want to spend his own money, even if he had it, to mount a challenge to win that prize. And so he had to look for investors. He found plenty of investors who were prepared to back him. So with the promise of money in hand, he went to the Bellanca Aircraft Company and spoke to Giuseppe Mario Bellanca about them building an aircraft for him to do the transatlantic flight. And Bellanca said, yeah, absolutely, we can build you an aircraft. It'll cost you normally $15,000, but because of the publicity that we can gain from this, we'll do it for $10,000. But we want a bit of a say in who's going to fly it. Now, Lindbergh was having none of that. He liked the price, but he wanted to fly the thing himself. That was non-negotiable as far as he was concerned. And Bellanca wouldn't move on that either. So, unfortunately, he didn't get an aircraft built by Bellanca, which was his first choice, and Bellanca didn't get the publicity that they would otherwise have got. Assuming a Bellanca aircraft would have made it, we'll never know. So then Lindbergh went to Cessna. Pretty much the same story with Cessna, same price and all that kind of stuff. Didn't want to know. So then he went to Ryan, who agreed to build him an aircraft and he would fly it and what have you. And that, of course, was the Spirit of St. Louis. Now, so Ryan built the Spirit of St. Louis and they charged him $6,000. So you could see that Charles Lindbergh was looking about for a bit of a bargain. But if you look at the Bellanca CF and you look at the Spirit of St. Louis, they are very, very similar looking. So it's quite obvious that Lindbergh had been looking at the Bellanca CF, wanting an aircraft of that type and that configuration, and had told Ryan that was the kind of thing he wanted. So that's the kind of influence that Bellanca aircraft had. Carrying on through the sort of 1920s and 1930s, Bellanca continued to build innovative aircraft. A lot of interesting ideas. For example, making the fuselage part of the lifting surfaces, so very streamlined fuselages. If you look at things like the Bellanca Cruise Air and the Cruise Master, you can see that kind of look. And one of those is because it's got a tail very similar to the Lockheed Constellation. It is quite often referred to as the cardboard Constellation, and not in an assaulting way either. The Constellation, if you look at that, the Lockheed Constellation, it has a very sort of humped fuselage, and that is an idea that is basically following on from one of Bellanca's ideas, which is to make the fuselage a lifting body. And so you can see that Bellanca's influence went fairly far and wide, and it's probably why he ended up on the cover of Time magazine. So Bellanca had made things like the Cruise Air and the Cruise Master. Now, sometimes these aircraft are referred to as, you'll see them referred to as things like the 14-7, and you think, what's all that about? And that's a naming convention that Bellanca used, which was he would take the wing area of the aircraft and then remove the last digit from it, and then he would take the horsepower of the engine and remove the last digit from that. So in the case of the Cruise Air, which was known as the 14-7, that's 140 square feet of wing area and a 70 horsepower engine, so it becomes the Bellanca Cruise Air 14-7. Now, again, the war intervened in Bellanca's design efforts, in this case the Second World War. He was producing aircraft that were very innovative in the 1940s, but of course wartime production in the United States curtailed civilian aircraft production, so it wasn't until after the Second World War that Bellanca started using innovations that had been developed in World War II and adding them to his aircraft after World War II, that made them really, really popular as private aeroplanes, and there are a lot of them now. It's from that what we now know as the Bellanca Viking was developed. Now, the Bellanca Viking, like most Bellanca aircraft, uses traditional construction, so it's not like your typical Cessna 172 or your PA-28 or what have you, which have stressed skin fuselages. The Bellanca aircraft use a tubular metal fuselage with material stretched over it, and then they use wooden wings. Typically they are spruce spars and ribs, and then they are sheeted over with plywood. Now that makes Bellanca aircraft very strong, very light, and extremely streamlined because there are no rivets sticking out from the surface. You have a completely smooth plywood wing, and you have smooth surface of fabric being stretched over a steel welded tube frame. Couple that with the fact that the Bellanca Viking has a 300 horsepower engine, and in some cases a turbocharged 300 horsepower engine, and you will know why the Bellanca Viking is an incredibly popular aeroplane. It's fast, it's light, and it's got a really high service ceiling. Now, as to why it's called the Bellanca Viking when all the other sort of Bellanca aircraft were called Cruise Air and Cruise Master and stuff like that, part of the construction of the spruce and plywood wings was built by a company that had a lot of Scandinavian employees because they'd emigrated to that area and settled in that area of the United States. So it was a bit of a nod to the fact that there were a lot of Scandinavian people producing the wings for the aircraft, so it became the Bellanca Viking as a bit of a nod to them. And the Bellanca Viking, about 1,350 of them were produced. Bellanca as an aircraft company doesn't exist anymore, but what is interesting is that it's so popular with people that own and fly Bellanca Vikings that 6 or 7 Bellanca owners got together, formed, I think it's called the Alexander Aircraft Company, to manufacture parts for their Bellanca Vikings, and they can manufacture pretty much anything for your Bellanca Viking. And in fact, I think I'm right in saying that they could, if you were prepared to throw enough money at them, build you a brand new Bellanca Viking from scratch, from parts. And they have in fact done that, I think, once or twice, certainly once that I know of. And the reason that they've done that, when people could obviously go and buy a different aircraft much more easily, is that Bellanca Vikings, people that fly them absolutely fall in love with them. They're well known for having beautifully harmonized controls. They're very fast, 226 knot cruise speed. They've got a good service ceiling of 17,000 feet. So these things are pretty sporty. And so they're really popular with people. So although when you look at the thing you think, yeah, it looks a bit like a Cessna, looks a bit like a Piper, it's not. We're in a completely different league here, and they've got a massive fan base. So it's interesting that a slightly unusual plane is made for Flight Simulator, and that's why I'm always very pleased when someone has a stab at one. So let's take a look at the one we've got here, which is for P3D.
Okay, so here we are in P3D version 5. First review that I'm doing for Chock's Hangar in P3D version 5. And we are looking at the Lionheart Creations Bellanca Viking. Let's have a bit of a closer look at the thing. So, there we go. Bit of a look at the nose, and then let's come in on there. Now you see good detailing on the wheels, plenty of polygons for the model, dirt spatters on and spatters from the propeller, oil spatters and what have you. So good detailing there. And then if we come around here, good texturing on the inside of the materials there for that kind of glass fiber look and what have you. So yeah, again, good details. And then up there, again, good detailing. If you look at the fairing panel on the wing, that's got a really good look of sort of alloy sheeting with the rivets on it and stuff. So really nice there. Very good texturing indeed, very convincing. Then we come back to the tail. Good detailing for the support struts for the tailplane. With the fittings going into the fuselage, and if we come round, there it is from the other side. Good detailing on the textures with the Bellanca logo. Nice light on the tail there, and then if we have a look at the cockpit, you can see very good detailing of not only the figures in the cockpit, but also the interior of the cockpit, and particularly the textures on the door and the seats and stuff like that. Pretty cool, really. And back there, if we do that, if I stop the propeller for a second, and we have a look at that, you can see good detailing on the propeller with the Macaulay logo on there, and good detailing on the spinner with the rivets and stuff like that. The riveting detail on this aeroplane is really good, even though for a lot of the surface there actually aren't any rivets visible, because obviously canvas covered fuselage or Dacron or whatever it is, and plywood covered wings, so not many rivets show up, but those that are on the aircraft are really, really well modelled. So let's go back on to the inside of the airplane. So we'll go to the onboard view, and then let's crank this thing up. Now, like most Lionheart aircraft, you can hide the yoke if you want to, which is kind of handy. Yeah. And then what we want to do is want to make sure that all of this stuff's on, and then what we should be able to do is start that thing up. Now, propeller control 100, so I'll pull that back a little bit, and the mixture is on cut. That's probably because we used control shift F1, so it should start now. And there we go. Now, on the subject of the sounds, before we take this thing for a bit of a fly around, it does use some of the default P3D sounds. So it uses things from the Rockwell and the Mooney, and some of the sound clicks are default and stuff like that. But you know, that's okay. You know, you could ally it to different engine sounds if you wanted to. Another thing worth noting is that unlike a lot of shiny new models that you get for P3D, this thing does not have 3D instruments. They are 2D instruments, and that's been done on purpose. It's not laziness or anything like that. It's because some people want to swap out the instruments for European instruments that read in different measurements and stuff like that. So it's been done on purpose. So it isn't laziness, and it does actually say that in the manual that it's so that you're not having problems with the swapping out instruments and what have you. So if you're expecting shiny 3D instruments in this thing, you're not going to get them. They are 2D. They look okay though, as you can see. They look fine. Instruments wise, you've got GPS and all that kind of stuff, and radios and all that, and obviously you can swap that out if you want to for other shinier stuff. It's a shame really that it doesn't have the kind of quirkiness of the original Lionheart Bellanca Viking, which was from, I think I might be right in saying, about 2009 or something like that. Now if you have got that, and I used that right up until I got this thing, because obviously this is a shinier replacement. But the older Bellanca Viking that dates from about 2008 does still work in P3D, works in FSX, even though it was compatible with FS 2004, or FS9 if you prefer to call it that. But that thing had some nice quirks in it. One of them was it had a little cubby hole here that if you pressed, a sort of GPS folded out of it. I kind of like that. There was a couple of other nice touches on it. One of the things was the key was on a little key ring that rattled as you and shook as you flew along. I thought that was a nice touch. And there was another nice touch in the older one, which was there was an oxygen regulator here with the switches, and if you turned that on, then on the exterior model of your crew and passengers in your plane, you could see that they then had the oxygen cannulas in their nose, and we don't get any of that in this thing. So there's a few nice touches that were in the older one that I kind of wish that they were in this, but they're not. Having said that, I think, generally speaking, this is a much nicer avionics suite. One of the things about the Bellanca Viking is it's a very sort of cozy cockpit. It's nice in that respect, and that's a very compact but fairly busy panel, so it's kind of nice that you don't have to zoom out a long way to see everything on there. And it's got a Century 3 autopilot, which is a very, very good simulation of that. And more about that when we start talking about the manual. So nothing particularly unusual on the interior of this, but very nicely done, and notably very nicely done for the texturing on the panels and the texturing of the materials and the seats and all that kind of stuff. Good job on that, and some good detailing in the back. If you actually maneuver to the back, there are actually some I think oil cans in the rear baggage area. I can't seem to manage to open the rear baggage door though, so I don't know whether whether that's sort of something that's going to be changed or what have you, but it's a bit of a shame that you have to kind of maneuver the camera to see them rather than being able to open the rear baggage door. But I couldn't get the rear baggage door open anyway. There are a lot of hidden sort of click spots for things on here, so most of the panels have got pop-ups and all that kind of stuff. If you're into that kind of thing, there's a lot of that, and it's all detailed in the manual, so that's pretty cool. If you like pop-up panels and all that kind of thing, there's a lot of that going on. So let's take this thing for a bit of a flight. Not going to bother with ATC or anything like that. Incidentally, ATC in P3D V5, pretty much the same as it was in previous versions. I know a few people will be disappointed to know that, but if you use add-on ATC, then ever was it so. Just a quick look at the exterior of P3D V5. One of the things that's really noticeable, because it's using DX12, is that the colours are a lot brighter. I've had to tone them down a little bit, although you will note on the exterior model of this that the windows look very, very blue. Now that's not P3D that's doing that, it is the model itself. It's got very, very blue tinted windows. Should we shut the door? But you can see the texturing is very, very nice, and the colours are very, very nice, very saturated in P3D V5. So I kind of like that. I know it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but of course you can tone down the saturation and the brightness in the graphic options just as you could with earlier versions of P3D. But I kind of like the bright and airy look of it. I think it's a very sunlit look, and I like it. So here we are, taxiing out to the runway. You'll notice that the lights, the navigation lights, are very, very nicely modelled on this. They flash a little bit kind of out of sequence, and that's kind of cool, you know what I mean? So yeah, that's a nice touch. The exterior texturing is very nice as well, particularly attention to detail where the canvas on the tail would have been stretched over the over the tubular framework of the metal tubular fuselage. It's nicely done. It does that on the tail as well, on the horizontal stabilizer. Good touch. This thing runs really, really smoothly. Part of that is that P3D V5 the way it's doing the graphics is a bit souped up, so it gets much better frame rates. But this is a nice model in terms of, despite the good detailing of it, in terms of frame rates, it's very nice. Anyway, off we go. We'll throttle this thing up. There's a bit of shaking going on there. And up we go. Bit of nose up trim, and then we'll go on the external view. And we'll have a look at the gear coming up. So hitting the G key. And off we go. So back in the cockpit. Now, since we're kind of giving P3D V5 a bit of a look whilst we're at it, I can't say I'm the world's biggest fan of the very blue colour of the water. You know, that is the Mersey estuary, not the Caribbean. And I don't think I've ever seen the Mersey estuary look that colour. And it is only 35 miles up the road from me, so I do know it. It tends to look a bit more like the Atlantic. Very sort of greyish brown looking and what have you. So yeah, I'm not the world's biggest fan of the watercolour, but you know, I guess I can tweak it. I mean, I have literally only got this simulator yesterday, so I haven't played around with it too much. Literally all I've done is I just backed off the colours a little bit. They were a little bit too saturated for my liking, but I kind of like the summery look that it's got now. Now, on the subject of the terrain, if we go on the external view, since we're also looking at P3D version 5 as well as the aeroplane, what we are looking at there is not the default scenery for P3D. What I have there is I have the Orbex, or Orbix if you prefer to pronounce it like that, Europe, then Orbix UK over that, which is why we can see there that's Ellesmere Port Oil Refinery, which is, you know, a reasonably accurate representation of it. Note that the Orbix scenery is not an exact replica of what you get if you go there for real. It's just kind of like a reasonably close stab at it, and you know, it's pretty good. Yeah, so scenery wise, that's Orbix or Orbex. The airport that we took off from is UK 2000's Liverpool John Lennon EGGP, which I've installed. So what you can see from that is that even though you kind of manually have to point some things at P3D V5, if you can do that, then things will work in it, or at least some things will work in it, notably the UK 2000 airport scenery and this Lionheart Bellanca Viking. I had to sort of point it at P3D, but it didn't have any problems coming in, absolutely none whatsoever, and neither did that UK 2000. And of course the Orbex stuff is, they're way ahead of the curve as they normally are, and that installs straight away, no problem, into V5. The other thing that I'm using here for this review is chase plane for some of the camera views. You probably worked that out as well, and again, chase plane updated for P3D V5. In terms of the graphics settings I've got here in P3D, I will bring that up on screen in a moment or two, but I would say they're sort of middle to high. We'll have a look at them in a minute or two, but really we're just kind of concentrating on this plane at the moment. So we'll go back in the cockpit and we'll find the airport. So there it is. Now, the Bellanca Viking is a very fast and slippery airplane, so I am going to need to slow it down a bit in order to get the gear and the flaps down. So I will do that. Airspeed's coming down to about 130, and I'm keeping the stick back to get the nose up, so we should now be able to drop some flaps. So there go the flaps, and there goes the gear. And down it comes. And if we go back in the cockpit, of course what we should really do is Just move that out of the way. Should get the landing lights on. So, you can see, obviously, being able to move the yoke out of the way is kind of handy. Although I could, of course, use chase plane for that if I wanted to. Now, how this thing flies, it's very nice. It does a reasonably convincing job of handling like the real thing, and that's kind of important because, as I say, the Bellanca Viking is noted for having really, really nicely harmonized controls and being easy to fly, and fairly responsive and fast. And performance-wise, this is pretty much on the numbers. So if it was horrible to fly and difficult to maneuver, that wouldn't be particularly convincing. But as you can see, I'm not having too many problems. I just did a little bit of side slipping there to get a little bit of height down. The real thing would normally come over the numbers at about 90 to 100 and touch down in the sort of 70 to 80 speed range. All that sort of stuff is in the manual if you need it. So you can see this thing, no problems. Runs okay, and P3D seems to be getting reasonably good frame rates, considering we've got a pay-where airport, a pay-where aircraft, and pay-where terrain in there. Seems to be doing all right. So let's get this thing down. We've not really been over too many roads, but I have got road traffic on, which would be having a bearing on it. Let's get a little bit of power on. And we'll try and get it down near the pappy lights. And there it goes. So, kind of nice to fly. So if we pop that on the external view, there it is. And I know that's not really the turn off that we should be using, but we'll give it a go. So get the flaps up and give it a bit of a turn. One thing that I did try and put in P3D V5, and it didn't seem to like it, was just like Traffic Global. It seemed to want to install, but then I started getting error messages for it, and it didn't like it. I didn't really spend ages trying to get it in there, but obviously it needs a little bit of a tweak. I think I probably could have got it working with a bit of effort, but I think I might wait for a more specific installer from the thing before I do that. So although frame rate wise this seems to be doing all right, bear in mind that I've not really got much in the way of air traffic going on. So I'll just bring this back in to my normal parking space that I use for reviews. Another thing that I would normally use on reviews is Lorbe's Where Are My Aircraft, to sort of bring in a few others to compare it with, but you know, I tried to get that working with P3D V5, and that wasn't having it either. I'm sure the developer of that will update that fairly quickly. He's usually pretty on the ball. There we go. One thing that did work was my scenery. See? Some of us are right on the ball with that. Now, here we go. I'll just kind of park this thing up, and then what we'll do is, just to kind of round things off, we'll have a look at some of the P3D options. So I'm going to put the parking brake on, and then what we'll do is we'll chop the throttle. I'm just using Control Shift F1 for that. One thing I will point out, nice animation wise, both internally and externally. There, you can see the prop blades altering like that. Nice. There's good attention to detail on this model, and it runs really, really well. So I have to say that I do really like this. If I have any criticism of this at all, it is with the manual, and it's not a problem with the manual's content per se, but it kind of is. If you know Lionheart Creations, you'll probably, if you've ever been to the website, you'll probably know that the developer has fairly strong religious feelings, and is not shy of mentioning them on his website, and that's fine. You know, if he wants to believe that, it's not something that I believe in, but you know, if he wants to believe that, that's okay. But what I don't want to see is I don't want to see that in the manual for an add-on aircraft. And at the end of the PDF manual for this aircraft, there is a bit of proselytizing about Jesus Christ and what have you, and it's not really appropriate for the manual. Believe it if you like, don't believe it if you like, it's entirely up to you. But in the same way that I don't want to have quotes from the Quran in the manual for a toaster that I've bought, I don't want stuff to do with Jesus and the Bible in the manual for my aeroplane, and I'll leave it at that. So if I had a complaint about it, that would be it. I think the developer ought to knock that off. Beyond that, I think this is a great add-on. You can see that it works really well on the latest sim. I did install it in version 4 as well. It works perfectly fine in that as well. No problems with it installing. It's a good price. It's $24.95 in dollars, which converted to about 22 quid in pounds sterling. And it was a reasonably small download. It's 891 megs in size, so less than a gigabyte in size, and installed really easily. Not all the places that you will be able to buy this from are up and running yet, but if you go to the Lionheart Creations website, you can find that you can buy it there from a direct link, which is where I got it. Wouldn't have been my favourite choice for doing it, but I wanted to get this because I'm a big fan of the Bellanca Viking, and despite my criticisms about that religious stuff, I am a big fan of Lionheart and their products. I do think they're great, and I do recommend this. Now, just before we finish the review, a little bit about P3D V5, because here we are in P3D V5, so we might as well have a look at it. So I'm going to hit the Alt key, and what I'm going to do is I'll go up to the options here. And now, if we look at the menus, you can see the first menu, not really anything different. The vehicle menu, not really anything different. Navigation menu, not really any different. Air traffic control is pretty much the same. The scenery library, it's got a slightly different look to it, but nothing that would confuse you too much. Options menu is very similar. View menu, all the same stuff. Analysis, network, tools, all that kind of stuff. Bit of virtual reality. And then there would normally be kind of add-on stuff here, but I've not really put many add-ons in yet, so there's nothing really too much in there. So the one that's probably worth looking at is when we look at the options here. And if we go to the general options and have a look at that, what we get is this slightly different way it appears. It is, generally speaking, the same stuff that we're looking at for traffic and realism settings and all this kind of stuff. There's a little bit about add-ons and all this kind of stuff. Scenery library is the same. Display settings, very, very similar. But what we start getting when we go into the world is a little bit more stuff going on with regard to enhanced atmospherics, which is beta. That's the true sky clouds that were in the flights, the sort of stillborn flight sim world. You've got God rays, crepuscular rays. That is the correct name for them, although I dare say the guy from Lionheart would call them God rays. So yeah, there's a few extra whistles and bells on here, and the lighting is broadly similar. And you can see on here that I've backed off the saturation a little bit and kicked up the brightness a little bit because of that. All of these settings here are the same, so not desperately different from earlier versions of P3D in terms of of what it's showing. I am noticing differences in some of the way the vehicles maneuver and stuff like that. I think that's perhaps a little bit better than it had been. Things like the cloud shadows are a bit more subtle than they would have been, and I must admit that I am missing being able to have active sky in this, because I'm not a fan of the sort of like default cookie cutter weather settings that you use. I think that's probably true for most people in flight simulators. But there you go. P3D version 5 seems to be all right. And if you're looking for a shiny new plane to use in P3D V5 that is equally as new as the sim and works just as well and is absolutely lovely, brilliantly developed, with a good manual, even despite my caveats about it, and some really, really nice modelling from a developer who knows how to create stuff well, then you can't really go wrong with this. Lionheart Creations Bellanca Viking. I really like it, and I'm pretty sure you will too. And if you had the previous version, there's a couple of things that are missing that were in the previous version, but they're not showstoppers. So I think you'll like it, and I think it's worth having the new version of it. So there you go. There's my review of the Lionheart Creations Bellanca Viking and the Super Viking. Turbo version is the Super Viking, and a little bit of a look at P3D V5. I may do a more full-on look at P3D V5 next week. I probably will when we know a little bit more about it. It's early days these days. We don't really know what works in it and what doesn't, and I need to play around with it a little bit. But look out for that. I probably will do something like that maybe next week. Anyway, in the meantime, if you like this stuff, like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. If you've got any comments or questions or anything like that, stick them in the comments below, and beyond that, everybody take care in these sort of difficult times with COVID-19 and what have you. Perhaps no better time to buy yourself a shiny new flight simulator plane and sit at home playing with it. There you go. Anyway, see you soon.